Well, good morning from St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here, and whether you're joining us here in person on Park Avenue or online, we're so glad that you're here for the forum, where each week we have sacred conversations about the things that matter. And today, as we observe our second annual Dia de los Muertos celebration here at St. Bart's, and we remember all those who have died. And as we approach All Saints' Day, we're having a conversation about Dia de los Muertos and how, especially in Mexico and beyond, folks have remembered those who have died. And we're very honored to have with us Professor Claudio Lomnitz from Columbia University. He's the Campbell Family Professor of Anthropology. He's the author of several books, including most germane to our discussion today, Death and the Idea of Mexico, which is actually available in our bookstore. So if you're really interested and want to learn more, this is a thick volume and you can buy it before you leave today. More recently, he's also the author of Nuestra America, which is a memoir about his life and his family. Professor Lomnitz, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here and honored to have this opportunity to share some information and some thoughts about this festivity of the Dias de Muertos. The plan is I'll speak maybe for 25 minutes, half hour max, and we get a chance to get some questions and to talk about the concerns or questions that you might have. First, the first point I think that is fundamental in thinking about this is to understand that this is not a peculiarly Mexican tradition. It's a Catholic tradition that had maybe a somewhat peculiar turn in Mexico. So that let's say the Dias de Muertos has a strong Mexican accent, but it doesn't really have a Mexican origin per se. So the origins of the Dias de Muertos are November 1st and 2nd, right? So All Saints' Day, All Souls' Day. And the origin of that hails back to the Middle Ages, and the abbot of the Abbey of Cluny in Paris actually was the inventor of All Souls' Day, because that was the time when the idea of purgatory started really becoming popular in Europe, and it didn't become formally accepted by the church until a little after the invention of All Souls' Day. So by the 12th, 13th century, the church makes purgatory an official dogma, but it was a popular idea and that had been kind of getting steam. And this abbot of Cluny's notion was he moved All Saints' Day, which had been celebrated, it's an older celebration, that actually was adopted from the days of Rome, and he moved them. He set it up so that you had All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day together. Sorry to talk a little bit about this, but the connection between those two is kind of important. So the notion was on the November 1st, we're going to celebrate the saints, that is, the people who have already acceded to heaven, to glory, to eternal life. And on the 2nd, we're going to be concerned with the souls that are on their way to heaven, but that are still suffering from the fires of purgatory. I mean, if you remember the idea of purgatory, it's kind of like a way station, usually represented as a kind of prison, actually. You see, when you see paintings of the souls in purgatory, and there are a lot of them in Mexico, in Mexican churches, you often see el ánima en pena, the soul who is purging his sins or her sins. So there's chains very often and flames. It looks very much like hell, but the difference between purgatory and hell is that hellfire is supposed to be eternal punishment for a sin that cannot be cleansed, whereas purgatorial fire was meant to cleanse the sins, because the idea was that you couldn't into heaven if you still had kind of unpaid sins. And the sins that you had to pay for in purgatory were known as venial sins. That is, they were sins that were not sufficiently grave that they couldn't actually be paid for. And so it's a little bit like serving time for the debts that you had accrued during your life, and you hadn't had a chance to pay off during your life. So you'd go to purgatory, pay them off, and spend a certain amount of time there. The idea of purgatory, comes around at a time sort of after the millennium, when people had been expecting the second coming of Jesus and the apocalypse, and after that came and went. You had also the beginning of kind of capitalist development in the Italian cities, in the cities in Holland that started becoming more commercial. And so along with this sort of urbanization, rise of a bourgeoisie in Europe, you also have the rise of venial sin. We know this, right? Cities are associated with sin, with sinning, and in some way the church became kind of more capacious in its management of this kind of, let's say, lesser sins with this notion of purgatory. So the notion was then that on November 1st you'd celebrate the saints, the people who were already in heaven, and who could intercede, by the way, including for the souls in purgatory, most notably the Virgin Mary, but all kinds of saints intercede. And if you look at the paintings of purgatory, and as I mentioned, Mexico is full of them, Mexican churches, colonial churches, you'll often find a saint who is fishing out the souls of purgatory and fishing them into heaven. And sometimes it's the Virgin Mary, but very often, for example, if it's a Franciscan church, it'll have St. Francis there with his cord fishing out. Or if it's St. Dominic, it's a Dominican church, you'll have St. Dominic with rosary, which is his symbol, and various saints would, let's say, use their, for example, instrument of martyrdom to fish out the souls from purgatory. So this is the origin, and the Spaniards come into Mexico. The fall of Mexico City is 1521. So for those of you who know a little bit about history, Mexico is conquered really around the time of the Council of Trent in Europe, and so around the time of the chasm between Protestants and Lutherans and Catholicism, and with that chasm comes for the case of Spain, a kind of hardening of some of these doctrines. So Mexico, let's say, originates at a time when the Catholic part of Europe really becomes more militant in some of these ideas. Martin Luther, if you remember, was himself an Augustinian monk, and so one of his main beefs against the church was exactly the doctrine of purgatory, which he felt was used to extract money from people, using kind of the fear of either hellfire or purgatorial fire, which is pretty scary too, by the way, in order to get people to pay monies to the church. And there's a lot in Luther that is really militantly against purgatory. So the Spaniards, who are the bulwark of, let's say, the point of view of the Vatican against Lutheranism, clamp down hard on this, and this is the context in which Mexico, New Spain, really starts. So the Mexico's first, let's say, iteration as a colony is happening at a time when, in a part in sort of the geopolitics of Christianity, where purgatory is super important. That's the first thing. A second thing to say about peculiar to Mexico is the Christianization of Mexico happened. There were very few friars, and there were a lot of people, because during the 16th century, I'm sure you all know, with the diseases that came from Europe, Africa, and Asia, that is, the Americas weren't connected to the other continents, and so diseases that came in with the Spaniards generated a series of major epidemics throughout the Americas and in New Spain, and the population between the time of the arrival of the Spaniards and the beginning of the 17th century came down to, we don't know exactly the numbers because, but we do have some sense of the numbers, and they came down really drastically. About 90% of the population, 95% of the population, 85% of the population, depending on the calculus, was lost in that first, let's say, 80 years in a set of epidemics. So the Spaniards are coming in, and with them is coming a set of kind of cataclysmic events. You look at the epidemics, and they're happening every 9 years, every 10 years, every 8 years, every 11 years. You're having a new process. And because the process of the dying is, if you want to put it like this, it seems a little bit racialized or ethnified. I don't know how to say it because I don't think they thought of this quite as race or as ethnicity. These categories are ours, but seen from today, it's like the dying was marked by race because the Spaniards were already immune to some of these sicknesses. So the people who were being carried away are native peoples, and this gives more prestige in some way to the Catholic side of the equation, even though the native peoples very often didn't really have very much of a chance to understand the details of Christianity. They didn't have very much a chance because simply of the proportion of population. There were very, very few friars, and the population of New Spain was really enormous. To say nothing of the fact that it was multilingual, multi-ethnic, so there were many languages. The friars that came to New Spain, in my opinion, at least in the first generations, were highly capable, highly trained, highly educated in the beginning. Later, it's a little different. So you get a number of friars who are making grammars and dictionaries of all of these languages, but still all of this takes time. So if you think about it, what you're getting in Mexico is a process of Christianization, mass Christianization, without necessarily a lot of possibility of attending to details and to doctrinal details in particular. So things like purgatory, if you think about it, are sort of complicated doctrinally. You have to understand the difference between venial sin and mortal sin. And in the beginning, the friars were really concerned, they weren't really concerned with purgatory that much. They were concerned with heaven and hell because what they thought was, well, we're going to save these souls, and in particular in the face of this, let's say, great dying that was happening through the course of the 16th century, the friars also had a kind of urgency in saying, okay, we're going to at least save your soul for all eternity, because the pagans were seen as being condemned ex ante to hell. So the urgency was to baptize, the urgency was to save, and so the big, let's say, the big chasm for the friars in New Spain in the beginning was heaven, hell, not so much purgatory. For the conquistadores, purgatory was a big thing. For the conquerors, because they were all going to go to purgatory, and a lot of them were very worried about it and how long they would stay. Like, people, some of these conquistadores were pretty villainous. Like, for example, Pizarro in the conqueror of Peru, famously villainous, who was also first in Mexico, the Pizarro brothers, and then they went on to conquer Peru. And in his will, Pizarro leaves monies in his native Trujillo for the church that includes, for example, paying for monaguillo, I don't know how you say this in English, an altar boy to ring the bell for the souls of purgatory at midnight through the streets of Trujillo for all time. So these conquistadores, many of them have sinned a lot, and they don't think that they're going to hell because they're doing God's work, they're Christianizing, but they know they've sinned, heavily, so they're really quite obsessed with purgatory. The Spaniards coming in are obsessed with purgatory. The native peoples aren't so much, but the Days of the Dead become extremely popular locally, probably including in places that still didn't have the doctrine. So you see there are very few 16th century documents about that track what's happening in the Days of the Dead in Mexico. They're really, you can kind of count them. In the 17th and 18th century, you start getting better documentation. But in the 16th century already, you can see cases where it's clear that the festivity is huge in native villages, even though you can also see that those native villages didn't yet have a very good idea or clear idea of purgatory. And so let's say that, how do you say, being out of sync slightly between the popularity of the festivity and the doctrine that went with it, maybe opens a little bit of a window to say, well, look, some of what went into the Mexican Days of the Dead is not necessarily coming exclusively from the Catholic side, because they're getting heavily into this festival, but they don't yet have a fine-grained grasp on the content of the festivity. This is, I would say, true in the 16th century. By the 17th century, I think all of them do have a pretty good general idea of what purgatory, not all, but many people have a sort of good general idea, in part because wills started to become legally important. Leaving things and writing a will involved an idea of purgatory. It required often, or was strongly buttressed if it was, let's say, negotiated with a local parish priest. And so by the 17th, 18th century, you have, let's say, a little bit more Catholic doctrinal content in this festivity. I'll pause a little bit around what I've said so far, just to mention something. Because Mexico in the 20th century, we'll see that, kind of nationalizes the Días de Muertos, a little bit like Brazil kind of nationalized the carnival. I mean, I don't know, carnival is not a Brazilian, it's Mardi Gras, it's the days that precede Holy Week, right? The Pascuas, but it becomes like associated with Brazil. Somehow the Carnival of Rio becomes like a national thing. And in Mexico in the 20th century, the Days of the Dead become a kind of national thing. And to the extent in which they've become a national thing, there's a tendency in Mexico and also in the US, thanks to the huge Mexican presence and Mexican influence in the US, there's an attempt to kind of make it imagine it as a pre-Hispanic festival, as something that comes from the Aztecs, or that comes, and this is actually historically untrue. That is not the origin of the festivity. It does not come from the pre-Columbian times, but it does have some non-Catholic accents that have to do with this history in the 16th century. So there's a tendency, in my view, to exaggerate the pre-Columbian side that has to do with Mexican nationalism rather than with the history of the event. It has to do with the fact that the celebration is nationalized in the 20th century. And not before, by the way. Even in the 19th century, it's not yet nationalized. People realize that it's a very big thing in Mexico. So why did it become so big in the modern period? When I say modern period, Mexico becomes independent the wars of independence in Mexico begin in 1810, and they end in 1820. So Mexico becomes independent, a republic, in 1820. So 1820, 1821. And so what happens there, what's interesting about the Mexican case is that the church throughout Europe and in the Americas as well, in the 18th century, they start wanting to modernize. And they start kind of playing down the cult of purgatory. The cult of purgatory had been increasingly inflated in Spain. You can see this, for example, in the numbers of masses that were said at the death of a Spanish king. In the 16th century, at the death of, let's say, of Charles V. I can't remember the exact number of masses, but let's say it was about 30,000 masses that were to be said for the king upon his death. By 100 years later, they're up to like 100,000 masses at the death of a king. So you have a kind of inflationary process in the 17th century and the early 18th century still around the cult of purgatory. And how important you are has to do with how many masses are said for you when you die, for your soul, which is in purgatory, right? Everybody's soul, except for the saints, everybody's soul was going to purgatory, except for the saints and the really, really bad people or the pagans. Everybody was going to purgatory. So how many soul, how your, let's say, the masses said for your soul were an expression of your social significance and your money. And so this is happening in the 17th century, in the 18th century. But by the mid-18th century, with the Enlightenment, the church too starts kind of wanting to tone it down a bit and to modernize. And by the end of the 18th century, you have ideas about sickness. Since before then, of course, everyone was buried in the parishes, right? That is, and when I say buried in the parishes, I mean the churchyard, like you see here in New England, for example, or even in New York and the old churches, you can still see the people buried in the churchyard. But they also were buried in the church itself. I'm sure that you've seen that. The old church, there's still some old churches in Mexico, in Tlaxcala, for instance, where you had, let's say, a floor like this one, a wooden floor, and then with some, let's say, stone floor next to it, and you'd have, let's say, wooden planks that you could take out, and the dead would be buried there underneath, so that when people came to pray, they were also praying for the souls of their community, which was actually right there. They were actually praying on top of their dead or next to their dead. In the 18th century, that they start to feel that that's not healthy. There are new ideas about contagion and about health, and so they create these extramural cemeteries. So they take the dead out of the churches and into cemeteries that are supposed to be outside of the cities. This is a tremendously painful process and a tremendously unpopular process that involves a kind of, let's say, illustrated elite that felt that the old system was bad, but the general folk felt, well, they're taking, our dead from us, and they're putting them somewhere where there isn't anybody, outside of the city. So this is happening all over the Catholic world. But in Mexico, this begins around, in New Spain, this is before Mexico's independence, around the 1790s. So at the very end of the colonial period, and the 1790s, 1800s are a period where the Spanish Empire is in all kinds of wars. It's having all kinds of fiscal trouble. And so taking the dead out was fiscally actually quite a problem for the state, because people paid for masses and the state got some revenue from that, right? That's exactly what Martin Luther hated, right? But that's how it worked. And so the impopularity of the modernization led to a kind of really slow stumble, and the fact that the state, first the Spanish state and then the Mexican state, were always in fiscal crises. They never had money. They were always broke. This led to a process where the modernization was really very stumbling process that never really took off. And that led to a modern period that is 19th century period and even 20th century, but 19th century, where instead of sort of modernizing and kind of eliminating purgatory, or if not eliminating it, really marginalizing it, this thing kept on growing. And I'll maybe end with an image of that, and we can, I won't have time very much to talk about what happened in the 20th century in these remarks, but happy to do so in questions if you want. But let me end with a little image. As some of you know, Mexico, after it was a republic, underwent a set of foreign wars and foreign invasions, right? The war with the United States in 1846 to 1848, where Mexico lost half of its territory, and then it had before a Spanish invasion and a very small war with the French, but then they had a bigger war with the French, or a French intervention it's called, and that is the conservative part. There was a civil war in Mexico between conservatives and liberals after the war with the US, and the liberals won the war. The conservatives allied themselves with Napoleon III and brought in an emperor, Maximilian of Habsburg, the brother of Franz Joseph, the famous Franz Joseph who lived forever and ever. The First World War, if you remember, occurred in the context of a problem of succession that had to do still with Franz Joseph. So Maximilian was his little brother. He probably had a bit of a chip on his shoulder, like many little brothers do in systems of inheritance like that, where the big brother is a king and the little brother is nothing, or a duke or something. So he took on this thing of becoming the emperor of Mexico, came to Mexico. And then in 1867, again, they lost again to the liberals. Benito Juarez, a famous indigenous president of Mexico, had Maximilian shot. Anyway, the liberals were obviously absolutely against the Días de Muertos, right? Because they represented the worst, for them, the worst of the church. That is, the liberals were sort of like Martin Luther. They felt this was an exploitation of people's fears for the afterlife. Nevertheless, and also Maximilian Habsburg was also himself a liberal and an illustrated prince. So he didn't like this stuff either. But like it or not, during, let's say, in the 18th century in Mexico City, the Días de Muertos, the market for the Días de Muertos was the biggest market in the year, not only in Mexico City, but in the towns in Mexico. And it usually started a week before the Días de Muertos. So the Días de Muertos, the revving up for the Días de Muertos begin like a week before. Well, by the time Maximilian is there, the Días de Muertos start a week before, and the market ends on the day of the Virgin of Guadalupe, that is December 12th. In other words, it becomes a 6-7 week long thing. And so instead of modernizing, these liberals and when Benito Juarez wins, he still can't get rid of it. He says, well, we should get rid of it. We don't want it, but we don't want to take this from the people, blah, blah, blah. And so we'll add something. Each one of these guys who didn't like it but couldn't get rid of it kind of added a little something to it. So it becomes more and more like a layer cake. Maximilian added a kind of theater, high theater, and brought in a play, the Don Juan Tenorio, which is like Don Giovanni, same kind of thing, as a Day of the Dead thing. Juarez brought in a kind of something like what in London was the Crystal Palace. In other words, a science fair and an industrial fair, all on the Days of the Dead. So the Days of the Dead in Mexico, instead of languishing at the end of the 18th century, which happened in many places, kept growing because Mexico was under such political strain that the popularity of the festivity was something that in the end even authorities who hated it, which there were plenty of, felt that they had to join in. And so in the end, it was a sort of don't beat them, join them kind of situation. If you can't beat them, join them kind of situation, where finally, by the 20th century, even the Mexican government says, well, this is something that is ours. This is something that is distinctly Mexican. And in fact, it was to some degree something that is distinctly Mexican because it has a very peculiar history. Maybe I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Lomnitz. We have quite a few minutes for questions, so my colleague Bailey Regan is going to come around with question cards for those of you who are present here in the room. And those of you who are online can insert your questions into the live chat function on YouTube, the comments function on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. I wonder, as we're waiting for those questions to come in, if you can talk, you've talked about the Días de los Muertos as folk practices. What did this look like in the home or in the cemetery? What are the practices, and maybe that evolves over time, that the people engage in?
Yeah, by the 17th century, they start doing something that is still prevalent today, which are a combination of a home altar and an altar in the grave. The tradition was really not so much in the home initially, but more in the grave. People would go, and still go all over Mexico, to the cemeteries in the time right before or during the Días de Muertos, November 1st and 2nd, and clean their family graves, right? Spruce up the cemetery, leave offerings there. The offering, which is associated with the altar, was initially done always in the church and by the priest. People brought things to the church, and they were redistributed to the poor, ideally, because the poor were like the worldly equivalent of the souls in purgatory. The souls in purgatory were seen as the destitute among the destitute. And the reason why is because they could not help themselves. Once the soul is in purgatory, the soul can't do anything to accrue merit. They already had their chance in life, and they blew it, right? And so they're now stuck, and they have to pay for what they did in life. So the people making offerings for their dear ones in purgatory, the way in which they could express this solidarity was by giving things to the poor, because the poor were kind of an analog of the souls in purgatory. So initially the food offerings were done in the church and through the church. And the church actually didn't like the practice of giving food directly to the souls, because the priests felt that this was a misreading of the idea of the offering, that they weren't offering food directly to the soul, they were offering food to the soul but through the mediation of the church and the poor, right? Or children. Children also were the object of giving during these days. But people always had, this included in the Middle Ages in Europe too, but in Mexico this happened. People always felt that they were all giving directly to the souls, and indirectly, but also directly. And so the practice of the home altar, and also a little bit in the cemetery, but the whole home altar very often started including, for example, putting there not only flowers, candles, water, because the soul's in purgatory, since there's fire in purgatory, the soul is always thirsty. So one of the most important things always in an altar is water, a candle for the candles, etc., certain flowers, and the flowers that are used, which is a marigold, a particular marigold that you now see a lot in New York City. Before you didn't see it, but thanks to Mexican immigration you do, called cempasúchil. That is a pre-Columbian tradition of that flower being associated with the dead. But people then started saying, well, my loved one liked to smoke, so I'm going to leave him, his favorite cigarettes, or leave. They liked to. They were particularly fond of this or that dish, and so I might leave a dish of this or that in the altar. So what's interesting about the home altar tradition, which is one of the, I think, great Mexican developments, which is so wonderful in my opinion, is that it gives you a space and also an aesthetic, a time, a space, and an aesthetic in which to connect to your, not to the dead in the abstract, to your personal dead, the people who you've lost. And the altar, this thing that began as a slightly heterodox practice of leaving things directly for the dead, becomes also a way of personalizing them and remembering them very specifically. And this is something that became extremely powerful in Mexico, and I think is so remarkable that people outside of Mexico have been catching on and adopting it.
And I know you don't have time to go into this in too much depth, but what are key developments that happen in the 20th and 21st centuries in terms of practice? What's added?
In the 20th century, you had first, in Mexico had from 1910 to 1920 a social revolution, often considered the first social revolution of the 20th century, and which was a very bloody affair, a very tragic affair. And after that, the artists that emerged from there, for example, most famously Diego Rivera, the muralists who have had a lot of influence in the US too and elsewhere, started developing a kind of aesthetic for Mexico that included a mixture between, let's say, modernism, modern art, modern architecture, and pre-Columbian architecture, pre-Columbian sculpture. And the death symbolism, the skull, which is so prominent, particularly in Aztec sculpture and all that, but not only in Aztec, since they had a tendency to represent the skull simultaneously as a death and as a symbol simultaneously of death and of rebirth. All right, so there's a kind of which is not exclusive to the pre-Columbian things. You didn't see this in the Franciscans have that too, right? You have a cross, and then at the foot of the crucified Christ, you have a skull, which is in part the transcendence of the soul over the body, but it also has a sense of a kind of life and rebirth, right? So the modern artists of Mexico start saying, well, look, this Days of the Dead thing is something that connects our pre-Columbian stuff with the kind of society that we want to build. So you start getting an aesthetic that is a high culture aesthetic that elaborates this. That's one peculiarity. A second peculiarity, which is maybe germane here in the US, is the contrast with Halloween, because that's not something that was relevant in the 19th century or in the 18th century. But as Mexico and the US become more and more connected, the contrast between Días de Muertos and Halloween become an identitarian thing, which they weren't before, because the US wasn't that important culturally in Mexico, and Mexico wasn't that important culturally in the US. But as the 20th century progressed, and you had more and more migration, Mexican migration in the U.S., more and more American capital and American retirees and visitors to Mexico and the like, the contrast becomes more important. And because Halloween's origin is actually the same, Halloween is also related to the All Souls Day. The contrast becomes kind of nationalized, and that's a much more recent phenomenon, and it has made it more identitarian, which I think is not necessary.
Días de Muertos are peculiarly Mexican and also not just Mexican. Can you talk a little bit about this observance outside of Mexico? Questioner specifically wonders about elsewhere in Latin America, but also, as you said, in the US now.
For sure. I mean, I think it's a mistake to see the Días de Muertos as a peculiarly Mexican thing. First of all, there were a number of regions in Mexico that didn't really have it, because in Mexico, a lot of, for example, northern Mexico was developed later than the southern Mexico. It didn't have as much of a native accent, of an indigenous accent as southern and central Mexico. So many of the people that, if you talk to people, let's say of my generation, older, who are from the northern cities, let's say Monterrey or Chihuahua or something, they didn't really celebrate the Días de Muertos that much. I mean, they might have gone to All Souls, also stay in the church, but there wasn't the altars, there wasn't the going to the cemeteries, there was the weekly market or the bi-weekly market, the flowers, all the stuff that we associate with the Dias de Muertos didn't really exist in northern Mexico, and it became more important in part as Dias de Muertos become kind of nationalized and became a question of national identity. And so now you see it all over Mexico, but you didn't before. But there are a number of Latin American countries like Guatemala, for example, Peru, Bolivia, where you have Dias de Muertos that are not that different from those in Mexico, although maybe a little bit less hyper-developed. But you'll see similar. And also, I think throughout the Catholic world, some of the things like giving to children or the association between the souls in purgatory and, for example, sharing sweets with children. This you see in France, you see it in Italy. So I think it's important to look at those commonalities and to recognize them. Finally, I'd say that, in relation to this question, I'd say that in the US, there's been a big change with regard to the Dias de Muertos. It used to be not that long ago, that people thought, well, it's a cult of the dead, or it's a cult of even a satanic kind of thing, there was a lot of apprehension around many of the symbols that were important in Dia de Muertos, particularly the skull and all of that. And that, I think, has really changed in the U.S. I think the U.S. has really become much more familiar, much more deeply familiar with this than it was even 20 or 30 years ago.
And why do you think that change occurred? We had this Disney movie a few years ago, Coco, that I think really has educated, for good or ill, a lot of Americans on this observance. What do you make of that? As someone who wrote a book about this before the Disney movie, how did that change things?
Yeah, I even got an invitation from the Coco folks to go and see the preview of the film, which I sadly missed. Not for any principled reason. I wish I would have gone, but anyway, I couldn't make it. I would have liked to see. I think that what happens there is that in the U.S. and in Western Europe, in the 1960s, you started getting a critique of American and also Western European distancing from death. You started getting a number of psychologists, prominent sociologists saying, well, look, there's something wrong with us because we're shunting away, we're shunting the old, we're putting the old in old people's homes and they're dying there, and even the word death has become taboo. And this is a movement that began in the 60s and 70s. In France, in England, in the US, and in Germany. And when they started realizing that, people started fishing around for places that had alternative strategies with regard to death, dying, the relationship between the living and the dead. And many people then found their way to Mexico and said, well, look, here's a different tradition. And it has a real let's say, familiarity between the living and the dead. And whereas we've tried to push the dead, we didn't just stop in creating cemeteries outside of the cities where we were pushing the dead out of the churches and into the suburbs where nobody lived. We didn't stop there, we continued. And we then hospitalized it and medicalized it, and then death became something that was completely alien to us, and we can't continue living that way. So I think that in that respect, Mexico became a kind of, I would say something like a healing alternative that has enriched, people's ways of understanding that there were many alternatives. And I would say, too, that American, for example, Coco, this is tremendously popular in Mexico, it's not just in the US, or even sort of funkier things like the James Bond movie that starts off with a very weird, non-traditional Dia de Muertos parade, which is actually, it's a Hollywood creation that sort of takes stuff from the carnival in Rio and puts on death masks and sort of does. And this thing, which I thought was a total abomination when I saw it, although I'm used to abominations and tend to like them, but still an abomination nonetheless, is now become a tradition in Mexico. I mean, so American elaborations are also influential in Mexico, including Halloween, all of that. So we tend to sort of overemphasize the difference as if there were some kind of essential ethnified difference. I don't believe in that.
Well, and even trick-or-treating goes back to a practice of praying for those in purgatory and getting a cake in order to do so.
Exactly.
So there are all these connections.
The trick-or-treating, we didn't have the name in trick-or-treating in Mexico, but there was the tradition of children, so they tended to say it in a way that would, I think, be unpalatable in the US, because in Mexico they called it what it was, which is begging. Right? Here, the idea of begging is deeply looked down upon, so you don't say that the children in Halloween beg. In Mexico, we tend to be, call things what they are. Name them what they are. The children begged, and they did beg, and they were supposed to beg there because they were supposed to be like the souls in purgatory. They're stand-ins for the souls in purgatory. The souls in purgatory can't do anything but be pitiful.
So we have to stop, but I'll fit one last question in there very quickly. I know that you yourself are Jewish, and I'm wondering, I know that you feel connected to this observance, and I'm wondering if you can reflect a little on that and what it means that this is, what it says about Dias de Muertos kind of appeal beyond just Mexicans or just Catholics.
Yeah, no, I think that's important because, I'd be, in the tradition, I'd be, this is not a holiday for me. Before, anyone who was not Catholic, not just Jewish, say nothing about being Jewish, forget it, or Muslim, there's a word, but even being Protestant, that was already, you had to have been baptized to go to purgatory. So those of us who weren't baptized, this is not for us. This is for the souls in purgatory. That meant for the people who were baptized. For the rest, the route was directly to hell, right? And so there was no kind of way station, it's unlikely that someone like me would partake. But in the 20th century, what you get is a kind of secularization of the festival, where many people who are not necessarily Catholic, who don't necessarily believe in all of the doctrinal things, start taking it up. And the reason why, I think, is that, and this includes in Mexico, by the way, not just outside of Mexico. First of all, in Mexico, there's a big secular tradition. Second, there's a lot of Protestants as well. Third, there aren't that many other faiths, but there are a lot of Protestants. And there are a lot of atheists. It's a secularist state, right? And so, or agnostics. And that doesn't stop them necessarily from going into this. And a big example would be Diego Rivera, the famous Mexican artist and muralist, who's one of the people who really elaborated the aesthetics of the Dias de Muertos. And Diego Rivera, hated the church, hated priests, hated this, hated that. There he is, with the Dia de Muertos. I think that what happens is that there's a recognition among people from many different quarters, many different religious quarters, many different kinds of persuasions, that we don't have such a very good system for remembering our folks. Remembering those among us that we love and who died. And what's peculiar about this is particularly the tradition of the altar, it seems to me. The home altar in particular is that it gives you a time and a place of, let's say, conviviality, because the notion is that the dead come to the altar, visit, right? And then they go back. In some places, they stay for a month until the day of St. Andrew, which is at the end of November. And they're around, the souls in purgatory, around for a whole month, you know? And so people have a sense of an immediacy of presence of those who we've lost, which I think is super, super important, and something that I at least have really deeply treasured from this tradition.
Professor Lomnitz, thank you so much.
Not at all, thank you.
And thank you all for being here. We hope you'll stick around, whether you're joining us online or here in person, for worship at 11 a.m. with the singing of our choir of the Fore Requiem. We'll be remembering all those who have died over the past year. And then afterwards, we'll be having our own celebration of Dia de Muertos out on the terrace, and folks are already setting up for that. So especially if you're here in person, we hope you'll join us for that. And come back for the forum next week. We'll be celebrating All Saints Sunday, and we'll also be unveiling a new baptismal font for use here at St. Bart's, and the artist will be with us to explain the choices she made. So hope you'll be with us too. Thanks so much.